Glamorama by Bret Easton His model espionage story. Because it's him, I figured this could be interesting. But I ran into the same problem that I did with American Psycho. It felt repetitious. His characters are purposely shallow in both, which is fine. I don't have a problem with his characters. But the book is too long for the type of characters he uses. I'm a big fan of dark satire and criticizing the lifestyle of rich people, but I get bored at the 100-page mark, and I scanned a lot of it. I liked Luna Park better than American Psycho and Glamorama. It's shorter and there is more character development. If he would have cut this book down to 300 pages, I would have liked it more. He uses terse language and his books are highly sexual and the violence is graphic, which I liked, but isn't enough to get me through 500 plus pages. Overall, the book is okay for me. I like his podcast better. He goes after PC culture and does in-depth analysis of culture in general. He mostly avoids politics, but they creep up sometimes. I highly recommend you listen to it. But I'm a white, straight, cisgender male. And you should not listen to a fucking thing I say. Here's a clip.
At Sundance last January, ideology trumped aesthetics yet again, as it is prone to every year in Park City, but never on the scale of what happened with Nate Parker's The Birth of a Nation, which in the end became a personal and professional disaster for Nate Parker, caused by a culture that increasingly prizes ideology over aesthetics. But The Birth of a Nation narrative proves that aesthetics ultimately do matter. In fact, when we are talking about movies, they are all that should matter. Nate Parker is excellent as Nat Turner in The Birth of a Nation, and this is proven by the amount of close-ups he gives himself as also the director of the film. This is the movie he wrote and directed and produced about the rebellion led by the slave preacher Nat Turner in 1831. And I've noticed the actor Nate Parker in many films, especially in Gina Prince Bythewood's underrated Beyond the Lights, where it ultimately confirmed he was an unusually soulful, handsome, black leading man that could carry any number of films. The future for him was wide open. And he has a few scenes in The Birth of a Nation where he more than rises to the occasion and gives a stirring and powerful performance. There is also the rooting factor that Nate Parker spent years of his life trying to get this very difficult picture made, and the fact that he managed to get the $10 million needed to make this passion project after investing $100,000 of his own money on pre-production is inspiring, especially to anyone working in the wasteland that is DIY Hollywood in this moment. The actor Nate Parker is terrific, but his movie is a half-baked mess. It's not a disaster exactly, but aesthetically it needed to be so much more than it is to survive what ultimately happened to it. And though I'm no fan of 12 Years a Slave, I kept thinking while watching The Birth of a Nation that maybe if an artist like Steve McQueen had directed this, it certainly wouldn't have been as evasive and muddled and cliched at times. 12 Years a Slave had an art-conscious S&M freakishness to it, and if McQueen had made a movie from Parker's script for Birth of a Nation, he certainly wouldn't have left out showing the two rapes central to Nat Turner's radicalization, even though these rapes have been argued to be fictional and are only there in the movie to pump up its revenge melodrama, or leaving out the murders of white children and their mothers at the hand of the rebellion, including the decapitation of a white infant. And I'm not sure McQueen would have eliminated the drunkenness among the slaves participating in the rebellion's massacres either. The Birth of a Nation doesn't have the aesthetic conviction it needs to sway us. And by the time this podcast airs, the movie will have disappeared from theaters, and its chances of being nominated for any Oscars is now nil. And yet, the forces that conspired in the disastrous public reception of The Birth of a Nation's U.S. release are not exactly aesthetic, but ideological. The aesthetic problem comes later, and let it also be said that The Birth of a Nation is a much more interesting and actually better movie than the inept studio-produced white person non-thriller The Girl on the Train, which was supposedly the movie The Birth of a Nation was up against the weekend it opened. The Girl on the Train opened wide in 3,000 theaters and won the weekend with about $25 million. The Birth of a Nation also opened wide in over 2,000 theaters and underperformed with a gross of $7 million. So who is to blame for the movie's failure to connect with anyone, including reviewers, audiences, the Academy of Motion Pictures Arts and Sciences, who were being pressured to award the film since its premiere in January, and when it was shown for the Academy in its massive theater on Wilshire Boulevard just 2 weeks ago for its official Academy screening, the theater was only a quarter full. And reviewers who raved about the film in January at Sundance have been deconstructing the reviews from January, reevaluating their initial responses, and trying to figure out what Kool-Aid they had been drinking in Park City. Well, blame Sundance and blame Fox Searchlight for buying into the ideology of the moment, exploiting it, and ignoring the glaring aesthetic deficiencies of the film, which would come back later to haunt it. But the film premiered in the January swirl of Oscars So White and Black Lives Matter protests and the onslaught of black men being shot by police officers throughout the U.S. on what seemed like a daily basis, and the film became more than the sum of its poorly executed parts. The warning signs were all there. The standing ovation before the film was shown, the winning of the Audience Award and the Grand Jury Prize, and the crowning touch, the $17 million deal from Fox Searchlight, the most ever paid for a movie at any festival ever. The moral haze surrounding the movie's reception aided in the overall showbiz psychosis and ultimately blinded everyone involved when they mindlessly vaulted The Birth of a Nation to automatic Best Picture Oscar status. And yet several people at the premiere told me last spring that the movie they saw wasn't any good. And what had happened was that everyone had simply gotten caught up in the moment of it all. It was a feeling. It was a feeling. And yes, feelings are not facts. Let's say it again. Feelings are not facts. And honestly, its competition was non-existent. So, okay, Sundance awarding both Grand Jury and Audience Awards was excessive, yet not unexpected and not that big of a deal. But that didn't excuse the fact that the movie itself was a bust. So, what was Fox Searchlight buying for $18 million? The mood of the moment? An idea and not a film that would inspire and incite? A below-average Oscar bait movie that Oscar voters were being pressured to vote for or else? And the insanity of the Academy's overreaching during the Oscars So White meltdown? I say insanity because movies are supposed to be rewarded for their aesthetics. And what Academy President Cheryl Boone Isaac argued for and perpetrated was the opposite. If we have a more diverse membership, it will result in a more diverse list of nominees and films about diversity. This is a completely false and sentimental narrative. Diversity is a good thing. Forced diversity is not, and especially when it comes to art and artists. Art is not created by a democracy. Art is not created by the audience. About 7 years ago, the Academy Awards desperately tried to up their Nielsen ratings by allowing 10 Best Picture nominations instead of the standard 5, hoping that whatever would round out the best 10 nominees would be blockbusters, so viewership for the Oscars would be up, which is how the Academy makes its money. This never happened. Instead of voting for Harry Potter or a Marvel movie, the top 10 opened the door to more distinctly mediocre middlebrow prestige movies that no one has seen, and yet the Academy barely approves of. It never happened for the blockbuster. It is rarely nominated in that new top 10, and it is not going to happen with diversity by tossing in more diverse voters into the Academy mix, because the criteria for whether a movie is good or not has nothing to do with the ideology of diversity within it, and everything to do with the vision of an artist. It's just so condescending, and it's just pure dumb showbiz thinking. Hollywood is the problem, people, not the Academy. And that brings us to the notion of looking at the art and not the artist, a notion that a few smart people in this country do not believe in anymore, shockingly. Yes, comrade Snowflake, only good people should be allowed to create art. Yes, I'll notify the propaganda office, comrade Snowflake, and make sure everything is in place so only nice, good people with spotless records can make the movies now. We will only reward the diverse, the polite, and the clean. Good job, comrade Snowflake. We will only invest in good and flawless comrades now who adhere to our ideology. Just give me a fucking break. The problem is that nice, good people are not usually artists. Artists are usually messed up and flawed and selfish, and that's why they are artists. They are usually contradictions and enigmas and blindly passionate and obsessed like Laura Albert to create her hoax, and insanely driven like Nate Parker to make his somewhat lackluster spectacle. And what goes out the window when you're obsessed as an artist is always judgment. And it depends, I guess, on how you feel about that. I don't care. I don't care about Nate Parker's 17-year-old rape accusation and his subsequent acquittal. That is between him and his accuser and the courts, and it was settled. And I don't even care, as a gay man, that Parker has said on the record that he would never play a gay character because he would consider it emasculating. Fine, that's his prerogative. I don't care. I kind of get it, whatever. I still would cast Nate Parker in anything because I like his sheer talent, and yes, little snowflakes, I like his looks. I don't want to be friends with him, but I would work with him as an actor in a second because he can act, and I think he's really good looking. Yes, I am objectifying Nate Parker, and if this is triggering something in you, turn the fucking podcast off. Only nice people with very clean records and spotless Twitter accounts should be allowed to flourish and be accepted. Let's now vet everyone and make sure that something they did at 19 is still considered so horrible that we can't accept their attempts at art 17 years later. Which is exactly what happened to Nate Parker and The Birth of a Nation. The rape accusation and the acquittal came back into play, and hysterical feminists began boycotting the movie in various editorials, the most notable one published in the New York Times. What was Nate Parker supposed to do about a 17-year-old accusation that he was acquitted of when he was 19? Was he supposed to admit to it by saying he was sorry? When you point out to feminists that he was acquitted, you are confronted with the response that the judicial system is rigged against victims, it was most probably an unfair acquittal, and that every accusation must be believed. But until when? After the acquittal, it still must be believed? As someone who has been friends with men who were obviously falsely accused, I call utter bullshit on this. And this was the ideological trap that Nate Parker found himself in, and he refused to apologize. He stood his ground because he insisted he was innocent from a false accusation. But the movie was now unfairly tainted and doomed, and yet it could have survived if it had been better. If the movie was really good or a real Oscar contender, and if maybe a distributor had picked it up for maybe $7 million instead of $17 million, The Birth of a Nation team was demanding only offers over $12 million. Maybe the expectations would have been more modest, and Nate Parker wouldn't have been the latest sacrificial victim based on something that he was involved with 17 years ago. And there seems to be no evidence that anything like this has been connected with him since. So, should only good people with a flawless past be accepted by you, Comrade Snowflake? Should we only invest in the nicest people in the room? Is the freak and the taboo and the provocation getting drowned out in a miasma of politically correct victim ideology that attacks and wants to shut down free expression unless it follows a certain kind of progressive groupthink ideology? This is now, 17 years later, the real crime of this narrative. Don't see The Birth of a Nation because it's not a very good movie. That's fine. But don't boycott it because you feel victimized.